With us today is Bob Greifeld. He wrote most recently the book Market Mover: Lessons from a Decade of Change at Nasdaq. Bob is the former CEO and chairman of Nasdaq, and the book is great. He shares stories about his time there, the challenges he faced, the decisions he's made. Nasdaq, for those of you who don't know, is one of the world's largest stock exchanges. It was very, very focused on tech for a very long time, may still be. We'll find that out in a second. Bob joined as leader in the early 2000s, probably right when, from his perspective, he shouldn't have joined, but we'll talk with him about that. It was, things were in turmoil, and Bob's is a story of turnaround and kind of turning around the market and bringing in some big companies and kind of setting it up for success. He dealt with the dot-com bust, economic headwinds, technology disruption, the implosion of the U.S. housing market, the global crash that followed. And during Bob's leadership, the Nasdaq market value increased by 2,000%. So not bad by any standards. Bob, welcome to the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So, Bob, we're gonna talk about your time. Like I oftentimes I'm interviewing thought leaders and we're talking about ideas, and here it's much more interesting to talk about your own experience and what led to the ideas that are in your book. And I kind of want to take a walk down memory lane, if you will, in your time. And I want to start with the opening the opening line of the book, which is, "I'm 6 months too late." Right? Now, why did you think that? What was the time, and why did you think that?
Well, one is I make very clear, not just in that situation, but in other situations, I do not possess a magic wand. And I also have a firm belief that the difference between success and failure are two sides of a very thin dime. That is, you are not preordained to succeed, you're not preordained to fail. So in that context, when I said I'm too late, there might not be enough good things I can do in the time frame required to turn the ship around.
Got it. And what was happening? Describe the moment that you were coming into Nasdaq.
Yeah, so when I got hired by Nasdaq, it was an unusual hire. And that was born of the fact that there was some level of desperation there to reach out to somebody like myself. So Nasdaq had pioneered an exchange without a trading floor. The SEC had changed the rules where competitors were popping up with technology that was probably two generations forward of what Nasdaq had. So every single day, Nasdaq was losing money, and we did not have an unlimited balance sheet. Every day, we were losing market share to these upstart competitors. So we didn't have that much time to, one, stem the bleeding, and then two, reverse course and get on a positive trajectory.
Why did you take the job?
Well, one is at first I didn't want to take the job because I had been an entrepreneur for 10 years and I'd sold my company in 1999 and was with a great large company called SunGard Data Systems, which I assumed I would leave at some point and go back to my entrepreneurial roots. When you think about NASDAQ, you thought the opposite. You thought of an organization that was part of the regulator that wanted to spin out from the regulator and then go on its own for-profit public motive. But clearly, the NASDAQ I went to in 2003 was a far, far cry from anything that would be small and entrepreneurial. So that was my hesitation at the time.
And why did you end up doing it?
Well, one, I realized that it was an opportunity you could not pass up, right? So as you thought about it, as I talked to my wife, I realized, okay, this is something that you have to try to do. And I had a clear thought in my mind that I could, in fact, bring a lot of good to the organization. And after I was there for a while, I recognized how naive I was in terms of what all the challenges were for NASDAQ. I understood part of the elephant in terms of what we had to do, but I certainly did not understand the complete part of the job required.
You tell the story of how, in your view, you got the job. And I think it's an interesting story about how you approached the interview process. And it's instructive for people. So if you could just share very briefly, like what your approach was. Basically, you were up against a competitor where you felt like, this guy had the edge on you in terms of the sort of form and experience of someone who they were looking for. And so you took a certain approach.
Yeah, so what was interesting here, this fellow I had interviewed myself when I was on the board of Knight Securities to be the CEO of Knight. So I had a firsthand knowledge of how he performed in a 1 hour back and forth session. And he was quite impressive. And I said, why should I compete on his ground rules or the normal ground rules? So that last interview, when I realized, I knew had competition for the job, and then I knew I really wanted the job. I said, how do you then change the substance of the interview, the meeting, to suit what you can do? So I knew exactly what had to be done. So I took control of the first 15, 20 minutes, and I said, okay, these are the 5 things we're going to get done in the first 100 days, and went through them point by point by point. So that was my strong suit, not the particular articulation that's required going back and forth, question and answer, but really said, here is the agenda. Here are your problems, and here's what I can do uniquely to help solve them.
I love that. So now I'm going to tell you something you didn't know, which is right as you were coming on board, this is in the early 2000s, all of your direct reports, who you didn't know very well at that time, were going through setting goals for their businesses. And I was asked to come in as a consultant to help them do that. Right. And I sat down, and it was a colleague of mine who had asked me to help her come in and do that. And so I sat down with all of your direct reports, who you didn't know very well at this point, or even maybe at all, and they were really struggling to set goals for their parts of the business. I mean, they really couldn't do it. And I stopped the meeting and I said, guys, I don't get what's going on here. You're the leaders of this business. Why are you unable to set goals for the next year? And they said, really in unison, well, there's a new leader coming in. We don't know what he's going to want to do. And so we're waiting to find out what he wants to do before we set goals. And I said, how do you think he's going to figure it out? You're the leaders of the business. You got to go to him and tell him, here's what I think we should do, and then let him have a reaction to that. You're going to let him come in and just sit around and go, I don't know, what do you want me to do? And I really said it like that. I mean, I didn't pull any punches. And we got somewhere. But I'm curious now, I've never been able to ask you this, but I'm curious, when you walked in, what you saw with your senior leadership team and what impression you had.
Well, this is certainly a different podcast than I imagined. So that's a great counterpoint. So I would say, in a certain way, the people you met with were not that incorrect. So when I covered in the book, I came in there and I acted as the autocratic CEO. And I thought that was fundamentally necessary because, again, we did not have the time to continue.
Right.
So when I came in there, I knew exactly what had to be done on the transaction side, on the market side, right? So that point I was clear on. But to make myself sound a little more humble than those last comments, what I didn't know was really the listings business, the fact that government relations was a big part of the job, and also the corporate communications, the publicity, the public-facing part of it. So there I was incredibly naive, and I needed to be humbled to recognize how little I knew. But with respect to the transaction side, when I've been a software entrepreneur, we built our trading systems to tie into the Nasdaq marketplace. I was a founder of an ECN that competed with Nasdaq. So I knew more about what the task had to be than those folks did. And the fact is that obviously a lot of those folks didn't survive. And in the book, we cover that 2 of the folks you met with didn't make it till 8 o'clock the first day I started. And I said, we're going in a different direction. We appreciate your service, but it's best that we part ways now and not drag it out. So I would say, and that's one of the lessons of the book, you have rules that you live by, and you have to run really a organization that gets built on consensus. You want to have the buy-in from the troops. At the end of the day, the engagement of the people in the organization determines its success. But like any other rule, there are times when you have to ignore that. In the early days of Nasdaq, I said, okay, I've got a certain amount of time. I've lived this world. we've got to do this, right? And so it was more marching orders back then, and it changed as the organization itself evolved.
So that's totally consistent with your, you sort of said, here's the five things. You mentioned this earlier in our
Right.
conversation. Here's the five things I'm going to do. Get the right people on board, reduce bureaucracy, embrace fiscal discipline, overhaul technology, and stop being satisfied with number two.
Number two.
Right? And so I have two questions here. One is, so you just mentioned that you let go of a couple of people before 8 a.m. the first day. And that's a bold move, obviously. And I'm curious about how you knew to do that. I want to give you a counterpoint, which is, here's what goes on in my head. I'm thinking, I don't know if you've had enough time yet to know whether they can perform under your leadership. And the story I think of is Alan Mulally, who was CEO of Boeing, of course, and then Ford. And he had the same kind of turnaround as you did, right? He was looking at Ford and he turned around Ford. And he did it with, I think, 17 or 18 of the original 18 or 19, meaning he lost one person, but ultimately he turned around the business with all of those senior leaders. I'm not advocating that that's the right way to do it, but I'm curious to understand how you knew that I'm moving in a new direction and there's a bunch of people who are just not going to make it.
So I would say this. One, I knew that the organization wanted to be engaged in a discussion, a debate in terms of what kind of company we were and what kind of company we were about to become. And I, again, did not feel I had the time for that organizational discussion. So I knew that as soon as people came to work that day and that two of the senior people were gone, they knew that, okay, it was a different day, a different person in charge, and all the discussions that people wanted to have about what we should be ended, and they wanted to know what I wanted to get done. So we stopped that dialogue. I thought that was important. I need the whole organization to get to work that day, right? So that was, I think, probably a more dire situation than Ford there. But I would say this. That where I agree is the vast majority of the senior leaders, led by Adina, my successor, were there who self-identified, self-selected, say, I want to be part of this culture that's going to be performance-based. We're going to weigh, measure, and count everything. We're going to be competitive. So those people revealed themselves. Others obviously resigned. And one of my management mantras is we try to promote from within 80% of the time, right? 20% you go outside. If you don't do 100%, internally, then the culture gets too insular. It doesn't extend. It doesn't evolve. But 80% is obviously an overwhelming number of people coming from inside. And the feeling is very strongly that when you're there, right, you basically have been interviewing for years. You know the pluses and the minuses of the person, the developments and the strengths. As good as you can get at interviewing somebody, whether you want to do psychological tests, background checks, it's still a relative crapshoot compared to hiring your own people.
Right.
So that's kind of the North Star I go with. But then again, the message you'll have in the book is you got to do what you got to do when it's there. So I didn't have time, right? Our market share was down to 14%. We go below 10, then I lose the listings business, right? And then I lose the entire franchise.
Right.
And I didn't have that much time to continue to burn the money every day. So that was the dominant fact. I always say there's so many good facts, and the decisions you make are never black and white, right? It's always some shade of gray. So the dominant fact here was speed of the essence. I'm not saying that is the proper management technique over a period of time, but it's the proper one in that period of time. And certainly we survived, to live the other days.
Bob, I love that frame, which is the dominant fact. I think one of the consistent things I've seen in the strongest leaders, and I know this intimately from really successful leaders that I coach, but also, other leaders that I talk to, is I think the number one thing they're able to do is to distinguish signal from noise. Right? It's to say there's a whole lot of things going on. This is the one we're going to respond to because this is the one that's going to make the biggest difference. And this idea of there's a lot of facts going around, but this is the dominant fact that we have to deal with and we have to face is really powerful.
It's critical.
Yeah.
And what I would say with that, and it's directly related. You've got a chance to meet many CEOs, and so have I. And what I've noticed with every single one of them, they work very hard and they're very smart. So why do they fail, right? In my mind, they fail primarily because they choose to work not on the wrong things, but on the less right things, right? You have to pick the things that have the best levered use of your time, right?
Right.
And you have to be comfortable with doing other things that don't have a lever, not well or even bad, right? Your to-do list, you can never get through the whole to-do list. So you have to focus on the things that matter. You have to focus things that lever your time across the organization, across your customers there. So that's related to finding what is a dominant fact.
Yeah, you got to be willing to get B's and C's in some stuff. And for high achievers, we basically want to get A's in everything. And what you're saying is
Exactly.
choose
Yeah,
two subjects you want to get an A in, or maybe one subject you want to get an A in, and be comfortable with B's and C's and everything else.
you got it.
All right,
That's
I'm hoping
exactly
that
what I'm
my
saying.
children are not listening to this because I don't think this applies to school in the same way
No.
as it applies to business, but I totally resonate with what you're saying from business.
Right.
What's so interesting too is that this is so counter to so much of the sort of leader methodology that you hear these days about you come into an organization and the very first thing you do is you go on a listening tour and you spend 9 months, listening to hearing whatever. And what you're saying is that might be great for an ongoing concern in which we want to make a marginal difference in the growth, but we were in a crisis and in a turnaround, you have to really make some drastic, edgy, risky, very bold, strong moves to communicate something.
So related to that, I say it in the book, and you always have to seek effectiveness first and efficiency second, right? So
Right.
you have to be effective. We have to survive. That's the definition. When I first got there, the definition of effectiveness was survive. Survive meant we had to have growing market share. We had to be getting a path to profitability before our balance sheet ran out. So that's important. Then after that, on the efficiency, then you do the proper management things and develop that structure over time. And when I saw the delay in the Model 3, I said, okay, they're hyper efficient of how they want to make it. But first, you got to be effective and make the thing, and then you can improve the manufacturing processes later.
Right.
And so I always thought about that. And we did 47 acquisitions. And the first thing I would always say, let's make sure this acquisition is working for us. We can always make it more efficient. We have the rest of our lives to do that. That being said, we did it very quickly most of the time, but you always have to keep those antennae clearly straight in terms of what your job is.
Right. Let's go to get the right people on board. That was your first thing, and
Right.
was that primarily a function, Bob, of being very clear about what your message was and making some very quick decisions as to who was on board and who wasn't?
No, I think the right people on board is a constant process. But why I say that is you have to develop a 1, 3, 5 year strategic plan of where you're driving the bus. But you also have to recognize that you will be wrong every single time of where you're going. The road will change, the circumstances change, the competitive dynamic change, the market changes. So you have to have the athletes, the managers on the bus who can then respond to that, right? And you can certainly pigeonhole yourself in terms of getting a content expert in one job, but that job changes, right? And if they don't have that ability. So I fundamentally think that you are successful in life by responding to stimuli that's presented to yourself. And I would say to our managers that your job is no more complicated than a single-celled organism. And I said a single-cell organism knows how to respond to stimuli. That's your job. Be alert to the stimuli, respond to it.
So again, totally counterintuitive to what you read in a lot of leadership writing these days, which is you don't want to be reactive to circumstances. You want to be sort of thoughtful and intentional and strategic about the direction. But you're saying something very different. You're saying actually you kind of want to be reactive.
Yeah, and it's not too hard to square that circle, right? So you're reactive, if you know, are on a path, right, and you want to be dictatorial, this is the only path, then I think you'll find yourself wrong more often than not. And so, this is dwelling a little bit, but my view of the world was that the customers gave us the small things in terms of where we had to go with our product or direction, and they were important, right? Certainly important day to day. But in terms of the broad strategic direction, the broad product set, you have to come up with that yourself. There's no amount of market research. And then they say, well, how do you make that decision? Well, at the end of the day, you kind of make it in a gut feel. But the fact is, you build your database, right? You get your database as wide as you can. You get all the material in there. And then your artificial intelligence, your machine learning in your brain eventually kicks in and tells you, okay, this is the path we have to go on.
Right.
There.
I'm curious about, so I write, I don't know how much you know about me or the work that I do, but I write a lot about emotional courage and the willingness to feel as a critical path to the willingness to act. And what I'm so curious about, Bob, is if you can bring yourself back to, you're stepping into this turnaround situation, you're making some bold moves, you're defining a strategy, you're driving it through, you're making some quick decisions. What were you feeling in that moment? I mean, were you scared? Were you, full on running the race as fast as you could and ambitious? And it could be like a number of different things, but I'm wondering, like, you step into this huge challenge and I'm just curious emotionally what was going on for you at that moment.
So I would say a dominant thought that came back, and sometimes I was sleeping, is you felt like you were jumping off of a cliff where you could not see the bottom. So I knew I was taking steps where I couldn't be guaranteed that it would get the outcome we wanted. And that ties back to my comment about success and failure is not preordained. So it really was that feeling of jumping off a cliff. You have to do it. You don't want to do it, but you don't have a choice to do it because at the end of the day, you first and foremost have to survive. And the flip side of that, which I cover in the book, is when I decided it was time to retire, I knew that the jumping off the cliff feeling was past. I knew the organization did not need me as much as it did, in 2003. And I think on a very positive note, the management team was very strong and was able to then to carry on in a very successful way.
You said earlier you were 14% market share. You couldn't drop below 10. When you left, what was your market share?
We were in the 40s.
In the 40s. Okay, so massive.
Yeah.
And part of that, I'm assuming, was your acquisition strategy. You bought 45 companies during your time.
No, I would describe it this way. So we knew there were limits to what the U.S. equity markets could provide to us. So once we, got our technology in order, got our market share solidified and inched slowly up over the years, we said, okay, what did we do next? We lifted our head up and I said two things. One, we had to get more assets. So we went into U.S. equity options, right? We've been a pure equity play, and we had to get more global, right? We're clearly just a U.S. play. So we went cross-asset, cross-geography, I think, is how we really had our massive success. And then we also recognized that we had running our businesses was some of the best technology on the planet. And we productized that and we were able to sell that to others.
Mm-hmm. And that was your fourth point, which is overhaul your technology. And that was
and we didn't we wanted to overhaul, not to catch up, but to go further.
Right.
There. And we had to, because our markets were so intense, the performer requirements are so high. So if we went to Africa, we went to the Middle East, we went to Europe, we went to Asia, we really were kind of stepping back in time in terms of what their requirements were versus what we had developed in the States.
Right.
So we're in a great position to lever that.
And your competitors weren't doing that?
A couple tried. LSE tried, New York Stock Exchange tried, but we have a very, very high market share and provision of technology to other exchanges, to regulators, and increasingly broker dealers.
Right. You talked about, and I think about this in terms of your acquisitions, but also just broadly, about encouraging autonomy while fostering integration. You talk about this in the book. I think that's the $1 billion question. How do you encourage autonomy at the same time as you create integration? I'm curious if you could share, because this is true, by the way, not only for integrating businesses, but for individuals. Like, how do you, manage someone so that they have autonomy and they're part of a team and they're moving in the right direction and they're moving collectively and in alignment with everybody else? So, any hints or tricks or thoughts that you have around that?
Well, let's start with the compensation side. So what I say is people don't do what they're told to do, they do what they're paid to do, right? So as crass as that sounds. So when you think about it, we had stock options for every employee. So stock on a compensation side was unifying, right? Because the stock was performance was determined by how the entire firm did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when they had their individual goals, so we would have, as I said, our culture was to weigh, measure, and count everything. And the last thing I wanted to do was to have a situation where at the end of the year, people had to be nice to me to get a big bonus. So at the beginning of the year, every single employee had to say in great detail, these are the 10, 15 things that will determine success in my job for this year. End of the year, we say, okay, how'd you do on these 10 or 15 things? And it was a function, and that would determine your pay. I didn't have to like you, you didn't have to like me, but we had a common understanding this was the job. So we spent so much time in the beginning of the year focused on the job. Now, part of that obviously was playing well with others, because the further up you go, the org chart, the more you become interdependent there. So we had compensation plans associated with joint goals across different lines of business there. But I think the greater good was for these folks to focus on their Burger King and excel in that Burger King. And then the icing on the cake was integration together. Now, if one unit had to work together with another unit all day, every day, I said, probably the organization chart is wrong, right? So I came at it that way. Mm-hmm. I said, let me make sure this organization is smart with respect to what the daily work is, right? Because if you have to go across an organization boundary, as well as you might have an integrated firm, there's a friction associated with that. So I want to make sure all the proper work was within the smallest atomic unit possible. And that was, I think, one of the key parts of our success.
You talk about trust and challenging decisions that you have to make, which angered people. And I'm specifically thinking about the conversation that you had with Jamie Dimon that you talk about in the book, where he cursed you out on the phone. Can you talk about that dynamic tension of the necessity to make hard decisions and at the same time to really maintain important relationships?
Sure. Well, the Jamie Dimon conversation, I think, was somewhat unique there because we were going through the lobbying for Dodd-Frank, and there was a lot of emotion in the air.
Right.
And we were speaking for open markets, and we wanted to have central clearing. And J.P. Morgan, with the strongest balance sheet, central clearing wouldn't hurt them, but it would kind of equalize them against some of their competitors. So, that's to be expected. But yeah, what you're getting at is a great point. Is that exchanges have broker-dealers as their customers, and the exchanges are there to narrow the friction costs, the spread in the market, and thereby, by definition, narrowing the profit opportunity for the market participants. So that has always an underlying natural tension to it. Mm-hmm. So we live in a world now where I think that's easier to maintain relationships and people understand competitors who are also necessary partners, depending upon particular role. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a bigger issue back in 2003 than it is in 2019, 2020, because most everybody has a multi-dimensional relationship within their ecosystem. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious as I actually think about that story of Jamie Dimon, and I think about, you don't pull punches in the book. So, you talk about specific people, and they don't always show up in the most beautiful of ways. And I'm actually also thinking broadly, like in terms of concept. So full disclosure, my father was a specialist on the stock exchange. So, you don't speak so glowingly about specialists. Like, you sort of think of them as dinosaurs and my grandfather talked about, that concept of dinosaurs was also on the market and was a specialist. And I remember going down to the floor of the market when I was a kid and like watching people, I mean, they were doing this more in the American than the New York, but hand signals and you talk about that. And I'm just curious about what it's like and what happens for you, again, either emotionally or psychologically, or what the challenge is, if there was any challenge, of writing about people and things where you knew people would read it and feel, criticized or like not painted in the perfect light that they always might want to be seen in. And I'm just curious about how that was for you.
So let's make clear, in the book, Bob doesn't always come out looking great, right? So we spend a full chapter on Facebook, which is certainly one of the low points, if not the low point of my tenure. So we didn't shy away from things that are difficult for Bob. But I would say this, with respect to the specialist in particular, it's always difficult to me, and I think unfair, to do revisionist history, right? So the specialists in their day, before the advent of technology, a trading floor, a specialist, the floor broker, was a very efficient way of conducting transactions, right? So you had to centralize that. Now, computers and communication technology evolved to the point where you could do a better job than the physical specialist or floor broker. And I would say that I knew our transmission speeds were always faster than the fastest runner on the floor of any exchange, right? So you have people literally running to get an order, and I can move electrons at the speed of light. I said, that's, not really a fair fight. So the specialist, the floor, did their job for their particular point in history. It was time for the electronics to come forward and, really improve upon the market. So that's nothing personal. It's just a fact of life that happened there. So your grandfather and your father played a very important role in their time, right? And don't forget, we didn't have computers in our hands back then. All right, we didn't have a telecommunications network. We had a telephone, basically.
But yeah, and I'm not really that worried about my father and my grandfather, but I am curious about when you wrote about the conversation with Jamie Dimon and he's cursing you on the phone. I'm sure Jamie doesn't want to be seen as a guy who's sitting on the phone cursing at you. But I don't know. Did you check that with him beforehand? Did you talk to him about it?
No, I did not. I did not. But I would take it this way. Jamie Dimon was a passionate advocate for their position, right? A hard stop. And I was a passionate advocate for our position. So I had no professional issue or personal issue with Jamie's feelings on that. So that's kind of how life goes, right? And so J.P. Morgan's a great customer of Nasdaq. We use their investment banking services for many years, in addition to being a customer on the market side there. But with respect to central clearing, we had different points of view.
Right. What was your hardest decision that you made over the time that you were there?
Well, I think the hardest decision you make is when you have to let people go where they're innocent victims, right? So to the extent that somebody's not doing their job, right, the way it needs to be done, that's easy, right? To the extent that you're putting two companies together, right, and there's two people doing the same job and both of them are very competent at the job and you just have to choose one, that to me was always the hardest decision to make.
Right. So you were at Nasdaq 13 years. What was your high point?
Yeah. Well, I think that the high point was somewhat in the leaving, in that I felt so proud of the management team, right? That I felt some paternal feeling for it. So we talked about the fact that 80% of the people we groomed. I'd worked with Adina Friedman, my successor, for 12 years, and she had been intimately involved with the finalization of the team. So that, I always said that was my final grade, how that team was going to do, led by Adina. So I'm quite proud about that. So I think the beginning and the end, the beginning was clearly unique. I was capable of making many mistakes, which could have basically represented an existential threat to the company. I certainly made some mistakes, but not so many that we didn't, be able to get to a brighter future.
In some ways, at the beginning, I wonder whether there was something a little bit easier than in the middle, because, yes, you could have made decisions that were an existential threat, but the thing was already on the ground dying. And so, like, maybe it would have continued. I don't know that that would have been your fault. So there's like, I'm wondering if you had more of an excitement and freedom to take risks than maybe you did later on when it started to breathe more life.
Yeah, uh, I, I don't know, but I hear the logic you're saying, but that certainly wasn't the
That's
thought
not
I
how it
had in my
felt.
head.
That's not how it
No,
felt.
no, no, I owned it. You take the job, you own it, right? So if it imploded in my first week, I might point fingers, but by the third week, I owned it, right?
Yep.
At that
Yep.
point, right?
Anything you regret or wish you had done differently?
Well, obviously, Facebook, we wish we had done better, and I certainly regret that. I'm
Can you tell
happy
us
that we
very, very quickly what, for people who haven't read the book, what Facebook, what you're talking about with Facebook?
Well, the IPO day of Facebook was in, basically unmitigated disaster, which we were primarily responsible for. And what happened, to try to answer the question quickly, I recognize that the blame was primarily me, right? So it was primarily me because I had established a culture where the technology people had too much of a free reign. And the technology people developed this IPO software to be perfect and to be the enemy of the good. Unique set of circumstances with Facebook. The code could have run for another 1,000 years and never uncovered this weakness in it, but Facebook was unique. And coming out of it, I realized that I had established a culture, and the business unit that ran the business didn't have any real power to stand up to the technologists. So I had to really change the culture in some dramatic ways. And a classical CEO move when you have a problem like this is to fire everybody associated with it. So counted a, it makes you feel good, but in this situation, that would have been the easy but wrong thing to do. I had to
Right.
rebuild the organization. And what happened, the technology people who were accustomed to being basically lord of the manor, eventually, and it wasn't too long, they quit, right? Because they wanted to go back to a situation where it's less structured there. And these are great people. And if I had to do a startup business, they were the right people to do it. But Nasdaq was not that kind of environment, nor was the market demanding it. So that was a difficult time because also obviously got a lot of general publicity outside of the business world,
Hmm.
and we felt responsible.
And
And
arguably, like what you talked about in terms of the transition or the turning point that was, that oftentimes, this statement, "What got you here won't get you there," that you needed to do the technology people needed to rule the roost for a while in order to overhaul your technology. And at a certain point, that probably never would have ended had there not been some kind of a disaster that says, okay, we got to make a shift here, because otherwise, you know, it might sort of draw away from your success, but never actually be big enough that it would may force you to make a transition.
yeah, that is incredibly insightful. So I knew, in 2003, I changed, we would come out with a software release once a year, and that software would be bulletproof. So we had to look like our competitors who were coming out with software every week or month or day or something like that. So we went more to that side. And that was the right decision at that point. We would have been out of business if we didn't do that. Every day was a new day. But then the market had matured and we didn't mature back. So I knew there were some of the software engineers from 2003 who are no longer with us who were saying, hey, Bob, I knew this was going to happen. You were wrong to change the culture. But I was right then, but wrong not to kind of go full circle there.
Right.
And Facebook forced us to then recognize that we had to act more and more like a battleship as the market matured, as opposed to a little PT boat.
Bob, what's next for you?
Well, right now I'm chairman of Virtu, which is a technology trading firm. So I'm on the other side dealing with exchanges and complaining about how much they charge for market data. But when I came out of, and that wasn't really directly in the plan, but it's a great situation for me. And the founder is my long-term friend, Vinny Biolos. And so between Vinny and Doug, we have a great professional, personal relationship. But I came out of Nasdaq again, wanting to get back to my entrepreneur roots. So I'm more involved with fintech companies, not really some startup, but pretty much smaller companies where I invest personal money, I serve on the board, and we can really make a difference over time. That's the most fun for me.
One thing that comes up for you that you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I would say this. What I remember reading a business book on Bill Gates' early days, and in it he said, "I've never succeeded in anything tried to the first time." Right. So in terms of like what's a guiding principle, I said, okay, if Bill Gates is saying that, that's good advice for me. So I think I have been successful by not expecting to be instantaneously, achieving what I want to, but by staying with it. I always believe, great execution will beat great strategy every day of the week. So you just execute, come to work every day. And then related to that, and then I'll wrap up, is people always ask me, how do you get to where you are, Bob? How can you be that successful? And I said, wait, hold on a second. The first thing is I never had a career plan, right? What I did know, though, is I wanted to do things that I really had passion for. And if you have passion for it, you'll do it well, and then other opportunities present themselves. And I hate the concept of people trying to manage a career path where they have a step on a ladder where they're going to tie up a year or two of their precious life, to do that, right? You should not do that. You need to find things that you want to do. And it's also important to recognize that when I say you have to have passion, that doesn't mean at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning you're saying, thank God the weekend's over, right? Because, we all have ups and downs as human beings, but it means that by and large, you're very engaged, you have great satisfaction, great passion for what you're doing.
You remind me of one of my favorite quotes. I was just in London and I went to the Churchill War Rooms, which is definitely worth going to if you're in London.
Yes.
And there was this one quote that I remember from that I really love, which is his quote, which is, "Success is stumbling from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm," or with no loss of enthusiasm.
That's a great quote.
Stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. I mean, I think.
And well, he had a lot of failures too, so I couldn't agree with that quote more. That's the way I look at it. You just keep it, and then you'll get there. Get there.
We've been talking with Bob Greifeld. His book is Market Mover: Lessons from a Decade of Change at Nasdaq. Bob, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
I appreciate it. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.